big hurdle. It's not letting me go to full screen, but so you can see the big screen and those panel of thumbnails on the left. I think we'll just have to work with this. Okay, so let me go up to the top and we're going to start right here. And it's a pleasure. And thanks for the invitation. This is an easy presentation for me to give, though I put a lot of time into it. I have spent so much time at City Rock State Park. I've found in my botanical career the last 30 years, I tend to, rather than traveling all over the place, I don't have the time for one thing, but I like going back to a few of the same places again and again and again, different seasons, different years, so I can really learn thoroughly about that particular area. City of Rocks is one of those places down here in southwestern New Mexico. So it's named after rocks, and so we got plants, we have rocks here. To understand the vegetation here, we need to talk a little bit about the geology. I'm curious, how many of y'all, besides Bob and Carrie and Betty, I see she's here, how many of y'all have ever been to City of Rock State Park? I know you're in mute, and as I've learned in online teaching in the last year, there's this, maybe you all know this reactions. Give me a thumbs up if, or maybe you can, how many of you have been to City of Rocks? Maybe in a chat you can send that. Any of you?
Bill, this is Jim McGrath.
Hey, Jim. Jim's been there. Yeah.
Yes, I was there for your field trip at the annual meeting.
And you verified a few plants for me when we were there on a hot September day 2-3 years ago. Yeah, it's a wonderful place. So talk a little bit about the park itself, the geology. Sort of like, I call this the Stonehenge of southwestern New Mexico. And this is the access road. If you're familiar with this part of the state at all, you know, Highway 61 goes from 180 up to San Lorenzo and Mimbres, and then there's a little side access road. And this is what you see. I was just there yesterday. I bring my students here frequently. And you look in the distance and you see those, you wonder, what in the heck is that? There's nothing else like this around. Then you get a little bit closer and then you can see, yes, indeed, there are some rock pinnacles right here. And there's the visitor center there. If you visit the park, you should go in the visitor center. And they got some nice murals that explain a lot of aspects of what's going on in the park. But then you get in the park and immediately, I mean, that's what it looks like. There are 2 or 3 dozen campsites, and you can pull your vehicle in there and camp and pick your own little cluster of rocks right here. And I'll give you the big picture. This is not taken by a drone or from helicopter. There's a mountain, a recent acquisition to the park that you can climb up on the north end. And looking down, I know Betty knows Allison Boyd. She took this picture a number of years ago. That's what the park looks like from the air, or from the top of this mountain. And there's the visitor center. There's a loop road here. This is almost a mile long. You can go all the way around, and all the way around here, there are campsites that you have to make a reservation. In this time of COVID, you just can't drive in and claim a campsite. Things are a little bit more regulated. But you can claim your own little piece of the rocks here if you choose to camp here. And I want to tell you that the original part of the park, which was established in 1953, is a little less than a square mile. Now it adds up, it totals a little over 6 miles. In the last 15 years, there have been several significant acquisitions that I'll talk about that have really added to the amount of vegetation types and diversity that occurs in the park. So if everybody didn't have their mute on, and that's fine. And I asked this question yesterday when I brought my students out there in my range vegetation class, as we were looking at the Arizona cotton top, one of those desert grasses. I asked, and a few of my students had never been here. I said, how do you guys think, what's the origin of these rocks? And most of them have had a geology class or two. And they quickly offered up, well, it must be volcanic. And so I lifted off the internet this nice little graphic here, and you can read the caption. Gigantic ash flow from a nearby supervolcano caldera erupted about 35 million years ago. Eroded rocks are shaped by water and wind. And if you want to see something a little more dramatic, if you go in that visitor center, you'll see this mural. I just took this picture yesterday. And the murals inside the visitor center are really well done. So if you get down here, every time I go in there, which is quite frequently, I try to learn something new by reading these the signs associated with these murals. Okay, so that's the background, just kind of what the park looks like. It's originally a little less than a square mile. It's expanded greatly in the last 15 years. Now it's a little over 6 miles. And we're here to talk about plants. And here's one of the over 300 plant species that occur in the original almost square mile part of the park. And my challenge, and I'm working closely with a good buddy of mine, Tim Geddes, now that we have this additional area, which was acquired after I started this project in 2004, I got 5 more square miles rather, that I have to visit and inventory. And that's been a lot of fun, and that's been ongoing. So this is one of the many plants that occurs at City of Rocks. And as Sarah was kind of indicated, I'm going to give you a little background how I got interested in this park. It's pretty easy for me to explain. I grew up in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. I was just there last month, actually in July, visiting my folks. They're in their 80s, doing well. The same street corner that I grew up on 50 years ago, there they are, surrounded by boreal forest and peatlands. It's a great place to grow up. So high school math teacher for 9 years near Green Bay, Wisconsin, Go Packers. And so I had a lot of experience in my weekends and in summers exploring the northern hardwood forests. And of course, some of these boreal forests occur up in northern Wisconsin. I had a great graduate school education at Iowa State, and I did some projects in Tallgrass Prairie and did some projects in the driftless area. I just love, see, everywhere I've been, I just really developed this affinity for the vegetation, which is available. Got to spend 1 year in Colorado and lived in Colorado Springs. I taught as a visiting professor at Colorado College. And so I got to spend a little time exploring the Rocky Mountains, and that was great. And well, 2001, I arrived in southwestern New Mexico. And boy, was I blessed to have that happen, to be able to teach all these field courses down here at this university to all these students. 3.3 million acres of Gila National Forest, 3 wilderness areas, riparian forest. Of course, this is all, you know, the Gila River is basically that provides all the water. Obviously, we're in the Gila River watershed, and all these upland habitats all the way up to almost 11,000 feet when you get up into the Mogollons. This was a flora that I was somewhat familiar with from past projects in the Rocky Mountains, but leading up to why did I get interested in City of Rocks, I discovered that we also had southeast of and surrounding much of Silver City, where I live, all this desert grassland, desert shrubland. And I found out 20 years ago that I didn't know anything about this vegetation. I could obviously identify a cactus from Ocotillo, but this was a totally new flora. And I teach this class called range vegetation. I was teaching plant taxonomy at the time, and I realized this was a hole in my background. My time is limited. They keep us pretty busy here. And the City of Rocks is about 35 miles from Silver City. So in 2004, I decided that I think I'm going to take this on as a project. I'm going to do a plant inventory of this park. The major goal would be for me to learn these desert plants. It's more than just desert plants, as you're going to see. And here it is 15, 16 years later. I've learned a lot about a lot of the plants that occur in the park. And there's still some plants out there waiting for me to find. So that's why I got interested in this park. It's close. And it had a flora that was really a flora that I didn't know much about. And so it's just really been a lot of fun. So in 2004, I became acquainted with some plants most of you, or many of you are probably familiar with, things like desert marigold and Blackfoot daisy. This was all new to me. Let's go on to the next one here. Mariola, here's a name for you, spiny blue bowls. Sage leaf bahia, desert dandelion, all these things in the desert scrubland, the desert grassland. This is a really common plant in open areas. Twin leaf senna. Lots of grasses, as Jim knows, because he has a similar interest. And of course, Jim's interested in all plants. Graminoids, black grama, bush muley, tobosa, burrow grass, Arizona cottontop, plains love grass. All these desert grasses, many of these don't even occur at Silver City, 30 miles to the north. So this is where I cut my teeth in learning this flora. And of course, we have some of these cacti here, which are always nice to see. Twisted spine prickly pear, Fendler's prickly pear, little nipple cactus, Mammillaria hateri. These all occur at City of Rocks. And other plants which are thorny or spiny. You go in the south entrance and immediately to your right, there's the most nasty crucifixion thorn bush that I've ever seen. I shudder when I see this plant. And there's plenty of gray thorn that occurs in City of Rocks as well. So these are some of the more common plants which occur in the park that I had to learn how to identify so I could teach my students about them. Okay, so as Sarah indicated, I'm going to ask a couple questions here. A lot of you know Richard Felger. He unfortunately passed away within the last year. He spent some time at City of Rocks with me. Very accomplished botanist. He's published floras in book form. He and I got to talk a lot about plant inventories, and I'm going to share with you that as a floristic botanist, that's what I am. I've had some, when I was at Iowa State, some of the faculty there, I could tell they didn't think a whole lot of this type of science. Actually, someone was bold enough to ask me the question, what good is a plant list? Basically thinking this is some kind of antiquated pursuit. And so I thought a lot about that question in the last 20 years, and I think I have some answers, but so I thought it would be kind of interesting for us. We're talking about the flora of this state park to see, and I was very impressed when I got on your chapter website. You've got a number of floristic studies, the complete or the partial plant list that have been published. I was really impressed with that. What good is a plant list? What is the value of plant inventory work? And so I'm going to ask, take a minute, if you have some thoughts on this, maybe submit your response in a chat. And it's up to you, Sarah, if you want to have everybody unmute, I don't care, but I'd like to see what your thoughts are on what's the value of doing this basic plant inventory work, which is basically what this project is all about. So
let's take a minute with the chat.
Yeah. Richard in action. That's a great photograph. I think Dr. Kleiman took that photograph. What good is a plant list to anybody? And we have a pretty good plant list for City of Rock State Park right now. Anybody contributing anything there, Sarah?
Yeah, we have help others figure out where various species are and track ecosystem change over time, track climate change with site lists. We can see which species are coming and going, documenting plants in an area. If conditions change, then do the plants change, and establish a point in time for what is there. If we do not know what's there, we won't miss it when it's gone.
Boy, that's a pithy statement there. Wow, a rich statement. You got it. Yeah, if we've not documented it, yeah, well, I don't need to paraphrase that. Wow. Anything else? Well, if anything else comes to mind, just send it in the chat and we can come back to that. That was my first question. And having given a lot of thought to that challenge posed to me there in the mid-late 90s by a particular professor who I shan't name, I've thought a lot about this, and I stumbled upon this seminal paper about the process of doing plant inventory work. And I know some of you in here do that yourself. And there's a paper published in Bioscience by Michael Palmer, a very distinguished botanist I've never met. He retired from Oklahoma State a couple of years ago, but this is a very prominent journal. And he actually listed what should be in a good floristic study. A floristic study, that's the term we use for people who do plant inventory work and map vegetation, et cetera. And I'm not going to read all this, but one, I think, essential part of any floristic study, any plant inventory, and it kind of gets back to if we're documenting a flora in some decade or period of time, 50 years down the road, somebody looks at this plant list and says, gee, Norris et al. And my buddy Tim Geddes, who I've already alluded to, is going to be co-author on anything that comes out of this. They say that such and such a plant occurred here, but I'm not so sure we believe that. Well, how can you go and verify that? You need voucher specimens. And so I'm a big proponent of when the population can support it. Obviously, if you see one plant, you don't collect it. So if you're someone who does a lot of plant inventory work, you need to look this paper up. And of course, doing plant inventory work is serious science. These are my standard tools. Plant press. This is something not when I was in Iowa, I've done a lot of projects there. 2.5 gallon Ziploc bags. They're great for bagging plants. Throw them in the cooler hopefully filled with ice so you can get them back to the herbarium and press them before they dry out. This is something I don't think I ever used all my work in the Midwest prior to coming here, but I wouldn't live without these 2.5 gallon Ziploc bags. Field book, GPS unit, pry bar. I heard one of my students yesterday refer to this as a wonder bar, a pair of clippers if you're out collecting woody plants, things like cat claw and things like that. So these are the standard tools when you're out collecting plants as part of a plant inventory. However, it might be the case that some plants don't lend themselves to being collected, like this barrel cactus right here. So I need to replace this picture and put my smartphone in here rather than this camera. It is totally appropriate and legitimate if you want to document the occurrence of a plant that's not convenient to collect, to photo document it. And the rest of the process, labels on the herbarium sheet, et cetera, is the same. You still record the data about the plant in your field book, record whether lat long or UTM coordinates. But this is another way to document the occurrence of plants. And then the next part of the process, this is in our daily Zimmerman herbarium. And of course, you got a lot of work identifying plants. And then we have a great volunteer staff and some work study students up in our herbarium, second floor Harlan Hall, who mount these plants. By the way, our herbarium, when I got here 20 years ago, was founded by Dr. Dale Zimmerman in 1957. When he retired, well, actually, when I arrived here, there were about 18,000 specimens there, a lot of them collected by he and his son, Alan, great collectors. We now have about 32,000 specimens. So it's really grown. And there's Angela Flanders, some of you know her, one of our many great volunteers in the herbarium. And she enters the data on the label and the Cienaga so that anybody around the world, except, of course, threatened and endangered things, we're a little more protective about that. But every specimen in our herbarium is entered in Cienaga, and finally file the specimen away. So this is what goes on in the herbarium, in our herbarium. This is part of the process of doing a plant inventory. So anyhow, so from 2004, the next 10 years before I started expanding into these other areas that I alluded to, these additional properties, I started seeing some of the same plants again and again and again. And I started, they started taking on special significance. I started thinking about, if I were to design a logo for the park, what plant would it be if that logo were to be a plant? And so here's some candidates. I'm sure you recognize most of these plants here, and they all occur at City Rock State Park. And I finally concluded that if it was up to me, plant, which I think is, I wouldn't say it's rare, we saw it yesterday in my class, I would probably settle on this. This Arizona blue curls, a delicate little mint, and what a beautiful little flower that is. Okay, and I've seen this in a few other places, and Jim and some of the rest of you, I'm sure, have better knowledge of the distribution of this plant in New Mexico than I do. But you can reliably find this at City Rock State Park. Beautiful, delicate little mint. And so it's up to me, and if the park decides to adopt this is the official plant of the park, this would be it. Okay. And then, of course, I started thinking about all these plants that I'd seen for the first 10 years of this inventory. What is the most conspicuous exotic forb? Well, this used to be the case. We had a fair amount of African rue, but every time I saw it, and the park manager gave Madranio, graduate of WNMU, whenever some of his staff counted it, they dug it up, and I haven't seen this plant in the park in a number of years. So it occurs pretty close by, but this has been at the park. I think the most conspicuous exotic plant in the park is this, layman's love grass, good old Eragrastis lehmanniana, which it seems to me in the last 20 years is increasing in its abundance. These are some rust climbing pictures here. Fairly nondescript grass as grasses go. Branched inflorescence with some fairly short branches here, but this is really common in the park. I'm going to show you a picture of Table Mountain here in about the next 10, 15 minutes, which is a recent acquisition. I was just there on Saturday, and there's layman's love grass all the way up there. So this grass is getting around. So let me advance this. The most inconspicuous plant at City of Rocks has to be Mammillaria hateri, Hader's nipple cactus, which you know, in the winter, this thing kind of sinks down, sort of like the Wicked Witch of the West and the Wizard of Oz. But when you see it, when it's well hydrated, it's got this low dome. It's actually probably more common in the park than maybe the number of instances that I've seen it would indicate. Beautiful little plant, but you got to be looking for this. So this is a beautiful little cactus which occurs City Rock State Park. And somehow or another, I got fixated. I spent some time botanizing down in the Floridas, and I saw quite a bit of this tar bush. And it's, you know, it's a characteristic plant of the desert shrublands in the Southwest. And I was wondering, why can I not find this at City of Rocks? And for a number of years, I looked and looked and looked, and I see all these shrublands. And finally, about 6 years ago, Tim Geddes, my partner in this project, and we found a little patch of this on the trail on the way up to this mountain. I think we shook hands because, you know, why was this plant not at City of Rocks? So something that we really look hard for, and we finally found it. Okay, so I call this the most elusive plant at City of Rocks, Florensia cernua tarbush. The tastiest plant, I guess it depends on who you ask. One of the themes in this range vegetation class that I teach is forage value. And that's something that's part of the lexicon of ranchers. And I always tell my students what I've heard from a rancher friend of mine who has since moved on, who grew up down in the Boot Hill. He said, Bill, these grama grasses, like black grama, Cydos grama, blue grama, these are like Ben and Jerry's ice cream to a cow. And everybody remembers that. And I tell my students, at least the perennial grama grasses, boy, when wildlife cows really like this stuff. So I guess if you're a cow, this might hold that distinction of the most tasty plant at City of Rocks. Okay. And then occasionally I see this and I wonder, who's eating this soap tree yucca? And so I'm going to ask, I'm going to take a little drink of my Pepsi here. If you guys, if those of you in attendance have an idea who's eating soap tree yucca, this fibrous plant here, why don't you send that in the chat and we'll let Sarah share that with us all. Who's eating soap tree yucca? What animals eat this? So please, if you have some hypotheses, send them in the chat, please. Who would eat soap tree yucca like that?
Let's see, we have a javelina, a jackrabbit and or a javelina, a wood rat, or an antelope.
A lot of candidates. Okay, so that's a really fibrous plant. Somebody's eating soap tree yucca. It must be tasty to somebody, okay? And anyhow, so that's kind of thinking about what's the tastiest plant. Those are some things, depends on who you're thinking about, who's it tasty to. Most fragrant plant at City of Rocks. And I suppose if you're, some of these beetles here, patchy plume, I don't get much of an odor out of this. Apparently some of these insects do. Engelmann's prickly pear, insects there. Maybe they're attracted by the color. Maybe there's some fragrance we're just not picking up on. Honey mesquite. Some insects, I'm sure, can basically pick up on the fragrance of this plant. So I answered this question this weekend for myself. It's got to be Aloysia wrightii, Wright's bee bush. And if you've ever encountered this, boy, this thing just has the most pleasant fragrance that you can imagine. As I was hiking down from this mountain on Saturday, I smelled it before I saw it. It's very pleasant. So I guess it depends on who you ask, but some of these plants in the park are pretty fragrant. And the most foul smelling plant at City of Rocks, it's got to be this good old buffalo gourd. When I teach this to my students, I say, pick up that gourd and smell some of these leaves. It smells like an armpit or an old rancid t-shirt. This is a very smelly plant when you find it. As is this plant, which is planted along the road. This is not native to southwestern New Mexico, of course. This used to be Caesalpinia gillesii, according to Dr. Allred's updated version of Flora neo-mexicana. And now it's in the genus Erythrostemon, Erythrostemon gillesii. And this has the distinct smell of urine. I'm not kidding you. So I guess maybe this is tied with buffalo gourd as being some of the stinkiest plants in the park. The plant most likely to enhance performance, I don't know what kind of performance we're talking about, but don't try it. Mormon tea produces epinephrine, and people have died from having too much of this particular chemical produced by this plant. But you see animals browsing on this plant. Maybe there's a reason for that. So don't eat this stuff, okay? Mormon tea, that's plentiful at City of Rocks. The most annoying plants at City of Rocks, and this is partly my fault, occasionally I'll forget to bring my hiking boots and I'll put on a pair of tennis shoes and go hiking in the park, and I'll come out and invariably I'll feel the little spines coming up through the soles of my tennis shoes here, things like honey mesquite and this brown spine prickly pear. It's my own fault. But when you got these low-growing, thorny, spiny things that get in your tennis shoes, yeah, these could be kind of annoying, these native plants here. The most intimidating plant, I already indicated, told you what this is, crucifixion thorn. Boy, I look at this plant and boy, this is just a menacing plant, all those green stems. And if you find yourself back at City of Rocks, as I said, when you go, if you're looking for this plant to take some photographs, go through the south entrance. That's the entrance to the main part of the park. Immediately to your right, before you go up this overlook trail, it's a big monstrous crucifixion thorn there. I guess welcoming visitors. Okay. Then we have plant most likely to inflict pain at the park. I learned quick early on. I didn't know anything about old Tragia ramosa nose burn. I suspect some of you know if you pick this up, boy, your fingers are going to be burning. It's just worse than nettle. This is a really painful plant. And so when I collect this, there's a couple species which occur in the park. I use kid gloves, literally. So nose burn. And I always think of the song by The Who, won't get fooled again. Every time I see this plant, I kind of shake my finger at it. Nope, you're not going to fool me this time. I'm not handling you. I learned the first time. Okay. Lots of toxic plants at the park, but this is the one that most people know about. Woolly local weed, Astragalus mollissimus. This is a plant which I hear from the park manager, Gabe Madronial, frequently in the spring, early summer. Park visitors will bring this in. What is this? Of course, there's a lot of species of Astragalus. State of New Mexico, this is one that can be fairly easily identified by its fairly hairy foliage, and it indeed is toxic. Okay, so maybe this is more appropriate for me to say a conspicuous toxic plant at City of Rocks. And some questions come to mind when you do studies like this. And as I said, I like going back to the same area again and again and again. And I like to bring my students at Western New Mexico University down here because this is about as far north as you're going to find creosote. You go even a couple miles north, going north towards Silver City, it drops out. In City of Rocks, the elevation is not that much lower than Silver City itself. So I've always wondered why it is that creosote hasn't, and I've been here 20 years, this is my 21st year, why hasn't this thing started to slowly move north? I don't have an answer to this question. I don't know if Don Graves is here. We have a wonderful botanical garden here in Silver City that our local chapter manages, and they've actually got some creosote planted. I think creosote's a beautiful plant, though it's really abundant in places. You don't find this growing naturally north of City of Rocks. So that's a mystery that I have not solved. And here's a plant, getting back to Richard Felger. If you're not aware of this, he and Kelly Kincher and 3 other authors recently published New Mexico Press, Trees of the Gila. And he worked on that for quite a while. Richard was a true scientist. He was very thorough. And he heard me talking about what I thought was Arizona oak, which I have found in the park on that loop road. And this is my concept of Arizona oak. So I think that's what it is. And I've had Richard out there. And I think he agreed with that. He didn't disagree with my identification. You can see Arizona oak has kind of a patchy distribution, but you don't have to go down to the Chiricahuas to see it down here. If I want to show this to my students, I can show this on that loop road by one of the campsites. A couple big trees of Arizona oak. So this is a little aside because a lot of you knew Dr. Jack Carter, who I knew really, really well. And he wrote Trees and Shrubs in New Mexico, 3 editions of that. I remember asking Jack 4 or 5 years ago, of course, we have gray oak and scrub live oak. We've got sparingly Arizona oak. I asked Jack, of all these oaks in this complex, gray oak, scrub live oak, Arizona oak, et cetera, what proportion of these plants do you feel comfortable putting a name to? And Jack didn't miss a beat. He said, and he's very distinguished in the way he said this. Well, Bill, about 70%. And here's the expert on woody plant identification. He's acknowledging there's just so much introgression going on among these closely related oak species that it's hard to pinpoint them into one of those 3 boxes, particularly the gray oak and the scrub live oak, but Arizona oak is part of that group. So I think finally about Jack Carter in that conversation. I always share that story with my students. And here's some plants that are abundant in Silver City, and my daddy lives in Silver City, and some of you have been down here. There is no problem finding Bermuda grass or red stem fillery anywhere in Silver City, New Mexico. In fact, my range vegetation class, I showed this to my students the other day out in the lawn. The Guinness Book of World Records, when it was being published, listed Bermuda grass as being the #1 most noxious weed on the face of the earth. I don't know what the basis for that distinction is, but thankfully, and I've spent a lot of time in the park, I have not found Bermuda grass, nor have I found red stem fillery in the boundaries of City of Rocks, either the original square mile, and now it's added 5 additional square miles of property. So I'm knocking on my bald head here. Thank goodness for that. We don't need any more exotic plants in the park, and there aren't that many to begin with. So it's kind of interesting. These abundant weeds, these non-native plants, I have not found them in the park, and that's a good thing. So some summary statistics here, and I need to say that I've had a couple individuals participate in this project. Mr. Javier Kirker was a student of mine in 08-09. He's double major zoology botany, and he needed 4 credits to finish up his botany degree. So Javi said, I suggested to him that why don't you do a preliminary inventory, kind of flesh out the work I've been doing since 2004. Javier is now an employee of the Forest Service, and he added a lot of plants, and he's found some things with voucher specimens that I haven't seen. He'll be the 3rd author in any paper that comes out of this. And then I'll show you a picture of my buddy Tim Geddes here later on in the presentation, a Vietnam era vet who was a bus driver for much of his career. He retired here in 2012. I met him at a workshop put on again by Jack L. Carter when he was coming out with the 2nd edition of his tree and shrub book. And Tim found out about this project I'm doing, and he's got a southern drawl. He's from Mississippi. He asked me if it'll be okay if he tagged along. And I said, sure. And we've probably been out there 50 times together and just had a blast. A lot of doing plant inventory work is just the camaraderie. I've been out with a lot of different people. Jim mentioned he's been out there with me on our annual meeting down here 2-3 years ago. That's part of the fun, kind of sharing the excitement of discoveries. So this isn't just my work. A lot of this was contributed by Tim Geddes and Javier Kirker. So the original park, a little more than 320 taxa. And now this is an important figure here, and this, I'm going to put this in context. More than 90% of the flora, when you look at the plant list, consists of native plants. And this is important. I've spent a lot of time doing similar projects in areas in Iowa, a very altered state. And you're lucky, and whether you're doing some kind of a forest remnant or any kind of remnant, you're lucky to hit 80% proportion of the total list being native. Richard Felger told me that on parts of California, he spent a lot of time in San Diego. There are places you're lucky to hit 50% native species. So City of Rocks, which is one of the most popular state parks in the state of New Mexico, all kinds of visitors. Easter, that place is just overrun with people coming in with vehicles from all over the place. We still have much, great integrity in this flora. Greater than 90% of that flora is native. And less than 30 of these 300 plus taxa are non-native, including puncture vine and this Portulaca oleracea. There aren't that many species. I mean, layman's love grass would be another one, but there aren't that many non-native species at City of Rock State Park, despite all the traffic in and out of there. And that's, I think, is a real spectacular thing. So when you do these types of studies, it's always kind of standard to summarize what families are most diverse. And the last time I totaled it up, the aster family, about 57 taxa, the bean family, or the grass family rather, 51 taxa, the bean family, 21 taxa. I think you'd find these families near the top of any list when you need any kind of plant inventory done in the Southwest. These 3 families are going to be near the top. And similarly, it is at City of Rocks. Okay, whoops. Here we go. So the most diverse genera, Bouteloua, we saw all 6 of them yesterday out with my range vegetation class. Hairy grama, side oats, black grama, blue grama, 6 weeks grama, and needle grama. That was kind of fun, all in one place on the north end of the park. Lots of brachylias. This is the most diverse grass genus in the state of New Mexico, I believe. There are 6 taxa of Muhlenbergia, including ring muley, which is one of the most distinctive grasses in the state. So these are some of the more diverse genera in the state, in the City Rock State Park. And so those figures that I shared with you pertain to the original almost square mile of the park, which has been established in 1952, 1953. In the last 15 years, and I visited with the park manager, I was down at the park both Saturday and Sunday to kind of check on the figures and the dates of acquisition. This mountain north of the original park, this is called Table Mountain. It's about 5,700 feet in elevation. almost the elevation of Silver City. This was bequeathed to the park by Gene Simon, who passed away a couple of years ago. Gene, I never met. He was a real supporter of City Rock State Park. There's a great trail system. You can hike right up to the top here. So this is what I'm working on now, is kind of inventorying the plants up here. And if you have a chance, you're down in the park, you can hike up to the top in here and back in about 2 hours, which I did on Saturday. And I'm going to back up here. So when you look north of the original park and you see this mountain, you're going to see this little white area, this seam. That's what Tim and I call it. And I've been out there with Russ Kleiman, and we have found in this seam, I should say, Russ has found and identified 6 or 7 species of fern, like Stanley's cloak fern, and we've collected those. And actually, we've climbed down from the top of the mountain down this seam. That's another microhabitat, which adds to the diversity of the entire park. So there's some ferns in here. And when you get to the top of Table Mountain, you look down. The picture was not taken with a drone or from a helicopter. This is what you see. Allison, Betty knows her. She's a friend of ours down here in Silver City. She hiked up there with her husband, Jeff, I'm sure, took this great photograph. And you can see there's, the original park is basically down here. And gee, look at that. There's all those rocks down here. And here we are above it on the Table Mountain. Okay, it's really a spectacular view, and it makes the hike up worth it. And another recent acquisition, rather than taking, if you're familiar with this area at all, you get on Highway 61 and you go north past the Faywood Hot Springs, you hang a left on City of Rock's access road. But another part of the property bequeathed by Gene Simon is rangeland. You keep going on Highway 61 and you come to a lot gate. We happen to have a key. You go through the gate and you proceed. And you encounter a windmill, and you encounter a tank, and you encounter a wetland, and so more microhabitats for more plant species. So we call this, Tim and I, the South Windmill part of thinking about the entirety of the 6 square miles of City Rock State Park. So I've always wondered, some of you know that Bob Dylan wrote a song about Highway 61. I wonder if this is the Highway 61 he was writing about. I don't know, probably not. But I always think about that as a way I can remember the number of this highway to access this large rangeland. There's no cows on it now, but this large expanse of recent rangeland, which houses lots of desert vegetation, okay? And windmill, the tank, and I should say, this is Tim Gaddis right here. We just took this picture. He and I went out there on Sunday and looking for more plants. And there's a wetland that you can see in the vicinity of that windmill. You can see some giant Saccatone. There's some Elaeocharis around here. There's plants you don't find anywhere else in the park. So even though this is altered habitat, it's increasing the diversity of the park as a whole. And we found this stemless Townsend daisy a few years ago in the spring. We haven't found that anywhere else in the park. So by exploring these new acquisitions, we're adding to our knowledge of the flora of the park as a whole. And I always like to, when I'm teaching my range vegetation class, this is one of the easiest grasses to learn. Used to be Dasyacloa, now it's Monroa Pulchella fluff grass. And there's some areas around that windmill which are pretty thinly vegetated. You can see lots and lots of fluff grass around. You can see some of the history of this land here in this skull. So that's the South Windmill area. Back to the access road. Talk about a third acquisition to the park. This is where Jim accompanied me 2-3 years ago on a Native Plant Society field trip at the annual meeting. There is an honest to goodness Cienaga, which has been acquired by the park as part of a mitigation settlement with the mine. Of course, if you're familiar with southwestern New Mexico at all, mining is a really big part of the economy down here. So rather than heading straight north to the park proper, there's a little, I didn't have a photograph of this, there's a little parking area here, and it's about a 2.2 mile loop trail that you can hike down. And when you start on this trail, that's what the trail looks like. And as you look downhill, you'll see it looks like there's some trees out here. And then as you keep hiking, you will encounter, believe it or not, a Cienaga, a desert wetland. And there's bulrush down here, and there's just any number of wetland plants, Gooding's willow, cottonwood. Who would have anticipated or expected to find a little wetland in the middle of this broad, open, rather dry area. But indeed, City of Rocks now has its own little Cienaga. You can see there are some planks here to allow people to walk over some of the wettest parts of this park. We got a little story to tell you about that. So there's salt grass, which Distichus spicata. You can find this down in the Cienaga, the desert wetland. And then there's also yerba mansa along this these planks here, this boardwalk, if you will. And you might wonder why I included this picture. So a week ago Sunday, I hiked down to the Cienaga and I was about ready to take some pictures. This is a Russ climbing picture, by the way. I was standing about right here, starting to bend over, and guess what I heard beneath the planks, beneath my feet? Rattlesnake. Yeah, I heard a rattlesnake. And so I don't get too frightened by rattlesnakes, but I knew it was time for me to continue on my way along that boardwalk. And so so I took a picture of the boardwalk. It was like right here. And so that's what the yerba mansa looked like from this perspective. Of course, this is a Russ climbing picture. That's what it actually looks like. There's quite a bit of yerba mansa down here in the Cienaga. So I've had a lot of fun with Tim Geddes exploring these other areas of the park, and I will continue to have fun. Usually we do this on Sunday. And so I said at the beginning of the presentation, and Sarah alluded to this, I'm going to ask you two big questions. Here's the other one. This has been a lot of fun. It's important to document the flora of significant natural areas like City of Rocks State Park or any of these other state parks, which occur in New Mexico. But I'm always thinking in large terms, what is the importance of, what's that? Hello? Okay. I'm asking myself, what is the value of these remnants of natural vegetation from a conservation standpoint? And I think at least that original square mile, you've got desert grassland, you've got desert scrubland. There hasn't been cows on there for almost 70 years. This is a place you can go. As I've said, I bring my students out here to see what desert grassland looks like. When I moved here 21 years ago, I didn't know anything about the Southwest. I thought I was going to come down to something like the Sonoran Desert, seeing saguaro cacti. And I found out that, well, that's not what we have down here in southwestern New Mexico. We have kind of the northern elements of the Chihuahuan Desert here. So think about, from a conservation standpoint, let's do the same exercise we did about a half hour ago. Just if you had to justify the maintenance of this park, justify its existence in terms of its contribution as a remnant of native vegetation, and indeed it is. So I guess I could ask a question. So what? Why is this remnant of native vegetation so important? So if you have some ideas on that, why don't you send those in the chat, and maybe Sarah will read them to us. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about probably the most seminal scientific paper in my career as a scientist, where someone else who thought a lot about this. So if you would offer up some of your thoughts, why it's so important to preserve native vegetation remnants, and send them in a chat, and we're looking forward to hearing your thoughts. Is anything coming in, Sarah?
Well, I see one: serve as refugia for other native species.
Yeah.
And I guess I was thinking, show ecosystems to our children. And I was thinking just conservation. It's valuable to have these habitats, and a plant can't live in isolation.
Yep. Any other ideas come to mind about why it's so important to, these? Go ahead.
Yeah, this specific vegetation is unique to the world. And then as climate changes, it's important to have as much genetic diversity available for potential of adaptations to new conditions. Seed preservation for biodiversity.
Yeah.
Conserve diverse species for the future.
I think Saunders down in Australia has been talking to some of you folks because some of his ideas, he's got, there's 4 major tenets that he puts forth as to the value of preserving remnants of native vegetation. I think you've hit on 3 of them, and the other one is a little different than the other 3. You can read that. Remnants preserve individual species and their gene pools, and a couple of your suggestions feed right into that. I'm not aware that this is especially rare, an especially rare plant, Houstonia rubra. I found this once at City of Rocks, and I know people who've have the opportunity to spend a lot more time botanizing around here than I do have never seen this. Okay, I don't think it's a common plant. Some of you may beg to differ. Maybe we're on the edge of its distribution, but I just put this forth as an example. This plant is in the park. It's not real common. We are certainly preserving its genes for future generations. Okay, and then this is, again, these ideas come from this gentleman in Australia talking about preservation of vegetation remnants in Australia 30 years ago. They preserve particular ecosystems. I heard that word come up in one of your suggestions. Communities, habitats, and vegetation assemblages. Well, originally I had desert scrubland in here. Then I thought, gee, what is probably the most unique or uncommon vegetation type? The City of Rocks is probably this Cienaga, this wetland. And I wonder if that rattlesnake is still there. Probably is. But yeah, I mean, some of you know A.T. Cole down here and his wife, Cinda. They've just invested hundreds of hours of energy and resources into studying and preserving Cienagas in southwestern New Mexico. Remnants preserve important ecological and evolutionary processes. So I mentioned to Bob Wilcox, who is an avid birder. This is a rather nondescript sparrow, at least to some people, Cassin sparrow, but it has a spectacular flight display. You can reliably see this in the spring at the overlook. And this is one of the few sparrows that'll take flight and it'll sing while it's doing this big arc in the air. So an evolved courtship behavior, and of course their western diamondback eating the house finch, and the co-evolved mutualism between the yucca and the yucca moth. All these ecological and evolutionary relationships are preserved in the context of this vegetation remnant, City of Rocks State Park. And here's one that I think this is appropriate, particularly City of Rocks, which gets thousands of visitors a year. Remnants provide people opportunities to experience nature in different ways. And boy, somebody's having fun in there, camping. They have their own little piece of the park there, putting their tent between those pinnacles right there. So lots of people come out there and paint and photograph. They're just totally fascinated. I mean, as I am, I think anybody who goes there, how could you not be fascinated by this vast display of geological features? So as I'm wrapping up here, I'm just about done, and I alluded to this earlier. Part of doing these types of projects, and I find going back to the same place again and again. I've been out with students. I've been out, Javier Kirker, my wife Denise, Richard Felger, Russ Kleiman, that's one of my former students, Gabe Madrano, who's the park supervisor, Tony Godfrey, he was until recently, he was a fantastic biologist, photographer. Just a number of people I've shared some really memorable experiences with exploring different parts of the park. And there's Table Mountain again. And this is the last slide. This is a picture my friend Tim took. And he and I were talking about this over the weekend. And I said, Tim, I keep coming back to this photograph you took of Table Mountain in the snow. And he said he thinks he was lucky to have captured this mountain right after a snowstorm, but that just emphasizes the beauty of this park. So I've definitely had a love affair with City of Rocks State Park in my 20 years down here in southwestern New Mexico. And I hope if you've never been here, you have the opportunity to come down here and check it out. There's lots of hiking trails. If you're into birds, insects, plants, go into the visitor center, check out the murals, learn a little bit about the cultural history of the park, which I decided for time. I took some slides out of here. Major presence of the Mimbres culture and the conquistadors. There's evidence that they passed through the park. And it's just a wonderful place. So thanks for giving me an opportunity to talk about City of Rocks State Park in southwestern New Mexico down here near Silver City. I'm done. Okay.
Bill, thank you. Thank you so much. And I have one question I'm going to start with, but invite people to start typing other questions you may have into the chat, and we'll just go with that and have a little exchange here.
Yeah.
So Jim McGrath actually asked, does soil type have anything to do with whether the creosote or other plants may or may not occur at City of Rocks? So
I need to look
if you have
into
any
that.
thoughts on the soil type.
So I want to start off and say that's a very good question. As some of you know, when a professorial type like me says that's a very good question, it means he doesn't know. So I don't know the answer to that. But as I always do in projects like this, when it comes time to write it up, I will be looking at the soil maps. I've not done that yet. It'll be interesting to see if the soil type changes as you go, northwest towards Silver City. That's something I'm going to look at for sure. So, as Jim knows, you're an experienced botanist, great botanist. If you really want to understand the flora, you got to know something about the geology. You got to know something about, the soils. You got to know about the cultural history, who's lived there recently, who's lived there in the past. If you go into that visitor center, not only is there a nice mural of the volcano, there's a mural showing ancient rhinoceri, I guess it'd be rhinoceri, all these mammals which grazed and lived in southwestern New Mexico. All these things enter into the vegetation basically to contribute to what it is now. So, Jim, I do not know the answer to that question, but I'm going to look at some soil maps and see if there's a relationship. Good question.
So, what about lichen species? Are they part of your floral list?
No, but interesting that you asked that, because I'm a member of Friends of City of Rocks, which is a nonprofit organization that supports the park. We have a newsletter that I edit, and just yesterday I asked Dr. Russ Kleiman, who's been doing some lichen surveys at City of Rocks, if he'd be willing to write a little article about lichens of the park. And of course, Russ said yes. So as part of my flora, no. But Russ is in a parallel project, is beginning to document lichens. He's also starting to look at the mosses, and there's a few liverworts which occur in the park. It's kind of beyond my expertise. I should share with you, there's been a lot of this Tony Godfrey I alluded to. He's now working in a state park up near Raton. Boy, he's studied the butterflies, the birds, the dragonflies. There's a lot of different groups of organisms that have been studied by people over the years. Okay.